Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining us today. My name is Tasha Clemens, and I represent the Transportation Asset Performance Team in the Office of Infrastructure of Federal Highway Administration. Federal Highways, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, is very pleased to sponsor this webinar series. We feel it's a great way to bring people together around a series of important topics and to connect with the asset management community. We have a great team of speakers on the agenda today who will share practices that advance the consideration of equity in transportation asset management decisions. With this webinar, I am so excited and pleased to say that we have reached the 68th webinar in our series. FHWA's Transportation Asset Performance Team is committed to increasing knowledge and capabilities at transportation agencies across the U.S. So I encourage you to visit us online for more information and to gain access to available resources. And you should be able to see the address shown on the screen. And finally, I just want to say thank you for your participation. You will enjoy today's presentations. And so now I would like to turn it over to Anna McLaughlin, who will be able to give us an overview of today's webinar, to review today's agenda, and to introduce our speakers. Anna, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tasha. Hello, everyone. As Tasha said, I'm Anna McLaughlin. I'm the Program Director for Transportation Program Management here at AASHTO. And again, a very warm welcome to our webinar 68 in our Transportation Asset Management webinar series, sponsored both by FHWA and AASHTO. We're happy to have you here. Today's webinar will feature speakers from Colorado DOT, from Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, and the Minnesota DOT, discussing the emerging topic of equity and transportation asset management. We've presented webinars in a series every 2 months going back to 2012 on a variety of topics on asset management. And for more information on this webinar series, you can visit our TAM portal. It is tam-portal.com. Again, I like to drill this into everyone so everyone has this resource, and we can put the link in the chat. It's tam-portal.com. From there, you can click on events in the main menu to register for future webinars as we continue this great series. You'll also find archives of previous webinars, and links to videos and slides from today's webinars will be posted on the site after the webinar today. Our TAM portal is the home of AASHTO's Subcommittee on Asset Management. For information on the subcommittee, if you'd like to become involved, you can visit the TAM portal and click on Subcommittee on Asset Management under the Community menu. We would love to have you join an upcoming meeting. We meet monthly. If you have any suggestions on future webinar topics or have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the chat feature on Zoom. We will answer questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and we'll invite our audience members to unmute and share their views or questions during the group discussion session at the end. Until then, we hope you'll be careful to keep your audio connection muted so that our presenters are not interrupted. We appreciate that. Thank you. Again, a warm welcome, and I would like to now turn it over to Diane Gertner of Spy Pond Partners to give us an overview of today's webinar, to review today's agenda, and introduce our speakers. Thanks, Diane.
Hi, Anna, and everyone else. Thank you for joining us today. As Anna said, I'm with Spy Pond Partners. I'm filling in for Fiona Park today. And as Anna also mentioned, the purpose of this webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are to raise awareness of the importance of equity as an emerging topic in transportation, highlight practices that transportation agencies are using to incorporate equity into TAM decision-making, and learn about resources that exist and are being developed to help transportation agencies consider equity in TAM decision-making. This webinar series goal is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. For the agenda today, we started off by hearing from Anna and Tasha, and now I will introduce our speakers before each presentation. But in brief, they are William Johnson, the Performance and Asset Management Branch Manager at Colorado DOT. He will be providing an overview of today's webinar topic, as well as presenting information about FHWA's TAM Expert Task Group case studies and the NCHRP 08169 project on TAM and equity indicators. Jason Smiley of Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure will be sharing DOTI's asset management equity approach, and Shaker Rabban, Asset Management Planning Director with Minnesota DOT, will be discussing how MnDOT is integrating equity into its planning process. So, time permitting, we will have an open group discussion at the end. And just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using Zoom's chat feature anytime during the webinar, and we'll make sure to cover them at the end of the webinar. And in response to the most frequently asked questions, yes, we will make the slides and video available after today's webinar at tam-portal.com. And one final note for our presenters: to keep things moving along on schedule, I will chime in to remind you when you have just a couple of minutes remaining in your allotted time. And now I'll turn it over to our speakers. So we will begin with William Johnson. William leads the Performance and Asset Management Branch for the Colorado Department of Transportation, which is responsible for CDOT's performance measures, asset management, risk and resilience, and economics analysis programs. They provide tools to effectively measure, analyze, forecast, and communicate to staff and stakeholders the performance of Colorado's transportation programs, processes, and investment decisions. William has been with CDOT for over 24 years and previously served as the GIS Data Management Section Manager and as a mobility planner. He has an MS in Management and a BA in Land Use. William?
Thank you, Diane. I'm going to make an attempt here to share my screen as well as sound. Always appreciate the warning that if we go too long, you're going to gracefully play us off. As Diane said, I'm the Performance and Asset Management Branch Manager for CDOT. I also, in this capacity, serve as the chair of NCHRP 08169, which we will talk about, and that one deals with equity indicators for asset management. I'm a member of the TAM Expert Task Group. That is a group sponsored by FHWA that includes DOT members, MPO members, transit agencies, MPOs, and we just added some cities to the fray. Last, I am a member of AASHTO's Agency Area Management Committee Task Force on Equity. All these sort of align to helping me guide you through the presentations today. I wanted to provide some definitions on things, understanding that with all things, not all definitions apply equally across agencies or even across understandings. I think that we're all familiar with a definition for transportation asset management from FHWA that many people quote within their agency TAMs. I also wanted to provide you, just to establish a quick framework, a couple of definitions dealing with equity. There's one from the US DOT Equity Action Plan, which defines it as a consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment for all individuals, including those individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment. And then there is an additional one from FHWA's Transportation Equity and Planning, where it defines more of an action word of equity. Equity in transportation seeks fairness and mobility, accessibility to meet the needs of all community members. And with that, I did want to provide an opportunity for me just to talk to you about some of the tools that are available. And I think this is important because going through those definitions, all these tools that you see up here are provided by government agencies and very much conform to how it's defined there. I'm going to leave this up through a second, and I'm going to take some time to very clunkily just give you some brief information on it. That EPA EJ screening tool, or more or less EJ Screen, it's an environmental justice mapping and screening tool that provides nationally consistent data and approaches to combine environmental and demographic socioeconomic indicators. I think the key there when it comes to thinking about using this tool for TAM is those socioeconomic indicators, which includes people of color, low income, employment rate, English speaking limitations, high school education, age under 5, and age over 64. The next would be the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. There's a couple of different social vulnerability indexes. I chose the CDC one here. Lately, it's been the one that the feds have referenced a lot, and I see it's also the one that has been updated more currently. Social vulnerability in and of itself refers to the potential negative effects on communities caused by external stresses on human health. And those stresses could be anything from natural or human-caused disasters or disease outbreak. And reducing social vulnerability can decrease both human suffering and economic loss. Again, I think when you look at social vulnerability, we typically use it in risk management and resilience assessment, but definitely can be used in asset management, being that we're all supposed to have risk-based asset management plans and implement them. Give you an indication of the type of data that's included in it: socioeconomic status, household characteristics, racial and ethnic minority status, housing type, and transportation. I think you'll see a little bit of something here later that points to something called land use. And if you haven't thought about land use planning, it is definitely something to think about, especially with a lens towards asset management. Next is the National Risk Index. It's a data set and online tool that illustrates communities more at risk for natural hazard events. In that, they have 18 natural hazard events, everything from like avalanche, which affects me in Colorado, to coastal flooding, which affects the majority of the population. Also in there would be cold waves, droughts, earthquakes, and it heavily leverages information from that CDC Social Vulnerability Index. Additionally, that index includes information on something called community resilience, which is the ability of a community to prepare for anticipated natural events, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. Again, with an asset management lens and really looking at approaches towards risk-based asset management, having a good understanding of community resilience should come into play. The next is what people commonly refer to as the ACS, the American Community Survey, that is typically performed during the decennial census. They do update that annually based on estimates. The types of data that you see in that deal with social, economic, housing, demographic, housing estimates based on selected characteristics of those areas. Next is the planning and equity tool. And what that does is it allows users to view their TIP information projects with available national equity related data sets. Again, it uses the ACS data, it uses a lot of the boundary information, and also it's leveraging what's the US DOT Transportation Disadvantaged Communities data, which it's developed based off of the Justice 40. If you have not heard of Justice 40, that's US DOT's initiative to ensure that 40% of their investments through programs, through discretionary grants, is put towards disadvantaged communities. And then last is STEEP, the screening tool for equity analysis for projects. That's an interactive mapping tool that allows for quick screening of potential project locations and really looking at it to support Title VI, environmental justice, EJ, and other socioeconomic data. It's leveraging the ACS data as well. I've provided you quick QR codes there so you can reference directly those tools. I also wanted to provide an opportunity to give you a quick update on NCHRP 08169, the title of which you see there, Valuing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Transportation Asset Management. You can see there that the expected objectives include more information on definitions. This one, the desire there is to really focus on DEI definitions that are specific towards asset management. We also would like to be able to articulate what an equitable outcome may mean in terms of delivering a system that's at a state of good repair, or more so asset management investments and treatments. We want to develop a list of qualitative and quantitative performance measures to use. With that one, then I'd say that that's probably the key. In the asset management world, we get so used to modeling things based on data, and it can be very difficult when you, as opposed to one large project, you have many, sometimes hundreds of specific asset management projects, and you need to be able to have a data element to put into that model to help inform your investment decisions, and that's what we're trying to get there. You could see the rest of the list there. I'm going to jump here to the bottom of it, in which case everything that we develop with the 500K that we plan to invest in this research, we want to run it through some case studies and demonstrate the effect that including DEI has on investment decisions and asset management. I think the idea there is to prove that even with DEI considerations, that you're still going to be able to maintain achieving getting your state of good repair with your asset management investment decisions. And then last is the communication techniques. Let's just be honest, there's a lot of barriers we face when we try to bring something like equity into the discussion with things like asset management or things like risk management and resiliency. I'd say this one, we want to have some tools to arm you to be able to approach those discussions in a diplomatic and informed way. I'm going to save questions for the end. I'm not seeing the chat just yet. One thing I want to point out in this is there is some research going on, and there are some catalysts for research. One thing that you see here is a new, if you attended TRB, they sent out the critical issues in transportation for 2024 and beyond. And that top level there, equity, you can see that it is within their higher realm of how to achieve a thriving society. With equity, I think that they recognize a couple things. One is that historically transportation has had disproportionate impacts on communities. And also with those impacts, they are burdened with GHG challenges. They're also burdened with housing insecurities, as well as they tend to have a lower quality of life, as well as lower income levels. And so they identified that as a priority to get to. I mentioned land use before. You see it at the bottom there, dealing with foundational factors and policy levers. The governance there, I did want to spend a second talking about that. I think that we're all familiar or just despise data governance challenges. This is not that. This actually deals with how do different levels of government, local, state, federal government, other governmental agencies, or even nonprofits make decisions, and how can, through their decision making, sort of ease how those decisions are made or come to some consensus on what standards are. You'll see funding and finance. I have yet to see outside of Justice 40, anything that specifically sets a target for equity. I'm interested to hear from the other speakers how they're actually making their investment decisions in their programs. And it does discuss workforce. I think that every DOT probably has some internal initiatives dealing with workforce and ensuring that your workforce is diverse. I'd say the benefit of that is not necessarily that you, and I'm sorry, I'm pretty direct, not necessarily that you put a brown person in a chair. It's more so that they are empowered to bring forth an opinion and information to add to discussions, being it, how things are done in the workforce or actual investment decisions. Innovation, I think, 08169 has great potential to be innovative. I know that our speakers are going to be able to show some innovation in tools and process and investment decisions. Last, we are in the throes of developing research needs statements here. And in doing so, I just wanted to inform you that on May 23rd, 12 o'clock Eastern, there's going to be a research symposium. We're definitely being guided by the critical issues from TRB. These are just some of the topical statements that we have so far. I know that first one, monetizing equity and performance, I presented that, I think, yesterday, and it got people a little bit fired up. I keep it there just because I want to maintain that fire and encourage people to participate in the research symposium. That QR code there will link you to the registration page. But this gives you a good idea that, people are definitely thinking about how do I bring not just equity, but all these disciplines into balance with each other so that they can be considered together during those investment decision-making process. That bottom one there deals with something I mentioned before, equity's relationship to risk management and, risk-based asset management plans. Next, I'm going to talk to you about a paper, a case study that was performed by the TAM expert task group. Again, it's a task group that's made up of DOTs, MPOs, FHWA sponsors it. It includes transit agencies, and we just brought cities into it as well. I have a little video here. I thought about kicking it off before, but I'm just going to play it now. And this sort of sets the framework. If you're still asking yourself, what the heck does equity have to do with asset management? I think for me, nothing speaks better than this video. I'm going to shut up for a second and let this play.
A young Michigan boy is so fed up with potholes that he's taking matters into his own hands. He's fixing them himself. 12-year-old Monte Scott of Muskegon Heights has been using dirt from his backyard to fill potholes to help even out the road near his house. Monte says he's seen the damage potholes can do and is doing what he can to keep drivers safe.
I didn't want people messing up their cars like my mom did, because if somebody were to drive down the street, hit a pothole, mess up their car, spend $600-700 on their car to get it fixed, they would be mad.
So far, the 12-year-old has filled more than a dozen potholes near his family's home.
Yeah, so, I use that both as an explanation of why equity should matter. I think for me is when I first saw that video, really what resonated with me is, one is a decision was made in his community. A decision to invest or to not invest was made. And oftentimes when we make those decisions at our desk using models, using process, we very much remove ourselves from the effect it has on people within that community. And in that video, young Mr. Monty Scott is talking about, his mom's car was damaged by a pothole. And that's what we do. We try to maintain things in a state of good repair, and when we don't, it hits people in the pocket directly. And so that's the thing that I was thinking about when we initially proposed this to the TAM expert task group. Now, a link to the document is included there in the slide. I encourage you very much to go ahead and hit that, and you can read along with me. naturally it has an introduction where it's really talking about how do we emphasize inclusion and diversity in transportation, specifically transportation asset management. We also provide some definitions, of which I'll point you to them a little bit later in future slides. And those definitions help us establish the framework. What exactly is the equity challenge when it comes to asset management? For us is we really kind of searched far and wide to think about the policies and practices that exist now and develop case studies and to really rethink things. And then you have that moving forward is what's next? What do we need to focus on? Before this document was published, I gotta tell you, it was used to inform that 08169 NCHRP project. Now, in this, I think we wanted to recognize that planning and programming decisions may or may not have negative impacts. I think that research on the history of transportation absolutely shows that there is a negative impact on underrepresented communities in our investment decisions. The video I just showed you demonstrated that pretty plainly, that our programming and investment decisions can have negative impacts. We also want to recognize that equity is a federal priority. You're going to see in a future slide here a couple of executive orders. I know that USDOT's strategic plan calls out equity, and naturally, besides just a federal priority, you see that it's TRB's priority as well as AASHTO. The bipartisan infrastructure law does include funding to address equity-oriented approaches. Gotta tell you though, it's a little disappointing to see that nothing specifically towards asset management was called out, but nothing was not necessarily called out as well. If you look at things like Chrissy, it definitely asks you to think about Justice 40 within your proposal submissions. Again, that Justice 40 was calling for 40% of the monies from the feds, that is both programmatic as well as discretionary grants, that they would like that to go towards those underrepresented, disproportionately impacted communities. There you'll see that Executive Order 13985. Apologies, I don't remember that off the top of my head. I'll remember it after I get off this. And then the request for information on transportation equity data, that was sent out by USDOT, asking what is it that you're using in defining equity in this white paper. I do remember Executive Order 12898. That's the federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations from 1994. We've been thinking about equity in transportation long before that, but that definition still applies. Still got a lot of work to do. That FHWA Order 664023A is the federal actions to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. One thing I always say when it comes to thinking about equity in asset management or even transportation on a whole, it's not just minority populations, it's definitely looking at a number of demographic areas where distress or underrepresentation occurs. I know here in Colorado, about 64% falls under the category of disproportionately impacted community. And in that, when I look at the state, there are a lot of rural counties. And it's primarily because of low education, low income, and also housing insecurities that they're identified as such. There's USDOT Order 56102C. That is the U.S. Department of Transportation action to address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. And last, it's my state, Colorado Senate Bill 21260. It references Section 28. I think the important thing there is Senate Bill 260 in Colorado established an Office of Environmental Justice and Equity. And by de facto, we have a chief equity officer. Her name is Marcia Nelson. I work closely with her. And within that bill, it didn't just stand up the office. It said, hey, CDOT, you have to look at engineering, design, construction, and really identify and address technological challenges and information barriers that may prevent disproportionately impacted communities from participating fully in transportation decisions that affect their quality of life, health, and access to minority business and project delivery and identification decisions. In this paper, we discuss the potential impacts of inherent bias. You can see a quick graph here, how we analyze and invest in priorities, how we invest by favoring in urban areas, or really focus on vehicular activity with our investment decisions, and more so following along the pathway of how this leads to disparities and limits the options available to some of the communities that we're serving, pretty much all the communities that we're serving. Last, we have some examples here, and a quote from Tokes, who's now the Secretary of Transportation in California. Then he was the director of Caltrans. Listen to communities affected by inequity and implement change accordingly by altering the ways we evaluate and make investments in transportation. The 4 case studies that you see there, California, Minnesota, Mass, North Front Range, you're going to hear from Minnesota here, I think, is really were selected in terms of their excellence and their ability to try to head this off and implement things. I think it's a great document to read and should be a catalyst for future study. We also included some local documents. Oftentimes at a state DOT, we do see that cities are addressing this more head on. Thank you, Denver, for agreeing to participate in here. Throughout looking at the local examples here, we're going to dial in on that 5-step framework for equity analysis. That is, know your people, identify populations for analysis, consider their needs and their concerns, look at, what can the agency do to measure their impacts, and then determine what that disparity is. What is the delta between your normal decisions, the decisions that you should make with equity, and how it affects the total system as well as the people, and then develop those strategies to avoid or to manage or mitigate those inequities. The next steps here is we're still out there looking for topics. We want to advance research. That's why I did spend some time focusing on research. There it says, we need to look at developing a framework just so we can understand how do we consider equity in performance-based planning activities, which includes asset management. Look at ways we can develop performance measures. And that's part of that 08169 study. Look at understanding what inequity looks like, especially through a lens of asset management and in your communities. And then look for how can transportation agencies begin to address equity and become equity conscious, very outcome driven. And I call it conscientious outcomes. That means you're in pursuit of doing the most right. And then the second part here is really looking for opportunities to engage people. And we'd like to have more peer exchanges and more knowledge sharing and how we could do that. This webinar serves that. Last there is you see that quote there from Stacy Thompson. Any step toward equity is important. Where you see real action is when communities are listened to and lead advocacy groups are at the table and policymakers are making decisions based on all that. Thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to look at the chat really quick to see if I did get any questions.
I don't see
sweet.
any.
No questions for me, just a bunch of links. Thank you for your time. Thanks, Diane.
Well, they may have a bunch of questions for you at the end. So thank you very much, William, for the overview and for the information on the case studies and what's going on with this, at the higher national level. Our next speaker is Jason Smiley with Denver's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. Jason is the GIS data administrator in DOTI's performance office. During his time with the City and County of Denver, his work has primarily focused on transportation planning, implementation, and asset inventory management, as well as using data to drive decisions within the organization. Jason is the DOTI Asset Management Program Development Manager, overseeing the stand-up of the foundational elements of an asset management system. The next phase of this work will involve implementing enterprise-level asset management guidance into the various divisions and groups involved in the asset lifecycle stages of DOTI managed infrastructure. Jason?
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Nope. Bear with me for a second. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me to present this on this topic. This is something Denver is very passionate about, and I just want to caveat what I'll be covering today is really an overview of our top-down approach within the city of how the city assesses and implements equity within everything we do. But then I will focus on Dottie's approach and how we do this within our planning and asset management programs. So a few things I'll cover. Again, just an overview of what the city of Denver how we define equity. Some information there of how we implement this, again, from the mayor's office down, our departmental strategy and how this relates to our strategic priorities, and then go through how we've implemented this as we've begun to stand up our asset management program just over the last few years. We have really baked equity into everything we have done every step of the way, from our policy and program statement, and then now into as we build up some of the more detailed components of the asset management program and how we're doing that, how we assess equity, and how we ensure our investments are going into those underserved communities, and then how we're tracking our operations work and making sure that we are focused on those underserved communities. So Denver, how we define this, Denver believes that equity is when race and other social identities can no longer be used to predict life outcomes. So Denver has taken the approach, we believe that equity is achieved through the advancement of policies and practices that center those who are underrepresented and have been historically disadvantaged because of their neighborhood of residence, age, gender, disability, immigration status, primary language, education, income level, or race. So the key part there that I just want to point out is that advancement of policies and practices. So again, that top-down approach, beginning at the mayor's office and creating those policies and direction on how the departments will operate and what we are required to do. So then it becomes down the department's responsibility to identify and define how we're going to implement that into our department. So we already saw a similar slide to this, but this is how we communicate some of this outside of the department, within Dottie, and with our citizens. But essentially, equity is when everyone gets what they need. So we understand the barriers, circumstances, and conditions. And so from a transportation lens, you can see here, just in this image, those assets that we have to track and that we want to implement to ensure that everybody has the same ability to do what they need to do across our city. So starting at the mayor's office, one of the first things that was done was they established an Office of Social Equity and Innovation. So you can see the mission and vision here. The vision of this really carries throughout all the departments, and you'll see similar statements of both the mission and vision trickle down all the way into our asset management program statement and our policies. But with this, the was created in 2020 under our previous mayor, Michael Hancock. It was updated in 2022. Executive Order 146 was updated in 2022. So the OSEI was established to develop and implement the policies, programs, regulations, and initiatives of the city and county of Denver related to equity, and social justice. So the OSEI is our support arm within the city. So they help the departments, and they've helped Dottie implement these practices, implement these policies, provide guidance on data and how we use that to evaluate. They work with all the departments together to make sure we're all evaluating on a similar scale, similar process. So what we don't want to do is use data to identify communities that may not be classified as underserved. So we want to make sure all the various approaches by all the departments are in line with each other. So the OSEI has led a lot of that. They have just helped us get ourselves organized. So into the Dottie strategy, our mission, and you see it is gonna resonate from back up to the top, but the meat here: through its employees, we enhance the quality of life of Denver by safely and efficiently delivering effective, high quality, sustainable, and equitable public infrastructure and services. So, and as you can see, this goes beyond just our infrastructure. Our services too are a big part. We want to make sure our solid waste program that may not be managing assets, that they are providing the same services across the city, and they have the ability to do so. And so when we look at our fleet tracking, which is an asset management process, we want to ensure that fleet availability, this is just an example, is there for all of our communities, so so that no one gets ignored in some of those basic services. So the next statement here, also part of our strategy statement. So we'll achieve racial and social equity in transportation when one's race and other social identities can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, such as transportation choices and access, travel times, and economic or health outcomes. There are many initiatives that Dottie is taking to address this statement. So outside of asset management, we're also supplementing the local transit agency to ensure that some of these underserved communities have extra access to good, reliable transit. So we've implemented micro transit services in some of those communities or those neighborhoods that have traditionally fallen in that underserved community area. Many others that we do, but I'm not going to get into all of that right now. So the way we evaluate, and this is cities as well as departments, there's there are three pillars that we look at to evaluate equity. So our workforce, business, being how we work with the companies, consultants, vendors that help us, and our community. So how do we ensure those equitable outcomes within the communities we serve? That is really where the asset management piece mostly lives, but it carries over to our workforce as well. So we want to ensure that from a workforce perspective, we are recruiting talent that is not meets our equity goals. So our strategic priorities, every year, Dottie identifies what our primary strategy is. These change, not a wholesale change annually, but they do change every few years. But right now, our two highest priorities are asset management and equity. Asset management has been here for a couple of years. Equity has been here longer. So, and you can see these other priorities where asset management and equity trickle down into all these as well. Sustainability, customer service, community engagement, financial controls and management, all heavily tied to asset management. And so within all of these, equity is a piece of this. So while it is a strategic priority, it is also sprinkled across all of these other areas. So getting into our asset management program statement, you can see this also reflects back to the mayor's priority and to the department priorities. So build an adaptable asset management ecosystem driven by best practices that optimize infrastructure performance through data-driven and objective decision-making, while prioritizing stakeholder expectations and service levels that deliver the safe, sustainable, reliable, and equitable infrastructure investments. So starting with just the program statement, when we first started building up our asset management system just a few years ago, again, I mentioned we built equity into the very beginning discussions of this. So from the program statement and then moving into our service policy, which is our asset management policy, we built this as an acronym to be relatable to all of our staff across everybody who works for Dottie, but you can see equity is a big piece of this. So that last E of service, equity is represented there. Within our service policy, we have additional objectives. So these are our strategic objectives, and then under each of these, we have goals, other goals and objectives. So these are all defined out. I'm happy to share any of these. These are not secret documents by any means. So one of the things we published last year was our strategic asset management plan. So our SAMP really started, when we published this, it provided our overarching guidance for the department on how we're going to approach asset management, why we're doing this, how we're going to implement this across all the divisions doing this work. And it was also built in a way to be a bit of an education opportunity, because asset management was a four-letter word a little bit within the department. When we built out the goals for this, we aligned with, you'll see at the bottom, DME is mentioned there. That's Denver Moves Everyone. So that is our newly published as of last year as well, next 25-year transportation plan. So we align our asset management goals with that. But we also added collaboration as a goal, because that is a big piece we were missing. And then equity. Equity, you can see, trickles throughout every one of these goals. So it is baked into how we perform these, how we approach these objectives, and how we accomplish them. And so when we start talking about asset life cycle, really where equity is evaluated is at the beginning of this life cycle in the planning phases. And then we monitor throughout the lifespan of all of our assets, just to ensure that we are not ignoring or representing any of those underserved communities. So in the planning process, we evaluate projects and do our prioritization processes to ensure that the projects we're proposing, the assets that would be installed as part of those projects, that they really are helping those communities, that we're not just putting something there to say we're investing in these communities. We want it to enhance those communities. So ensuring that the work that we do really benefits those citizens and those underserved communities. We have a process for that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But then through the maintenance and operation, we can look at our investments and the impact of those investments. And then one thing we're working on now, and this will take a little bit of a little longer to really dial in, is how we look at the long-term impact of those investments. So changes within those communities, how it's benefited those people over time. So it's kind of a post implementation analysis that has to be done, and we're still kind of trying to figure out exactly what that looks like. There's a lot of data collection that goes with that, and a lot of it is stakeholder information, talking to those communities and understanding if the work we're doing is really bettering them. So one of our evaluation tools is the Dottie Equity Index. And so this was developed 5 years ago, I guess, was about when we started this. So I've been with the city for about 6.5 years. So this was one of the first equity projects I worked on for Dottie. So 2 executive directors ago, when the mayor's office started really pushing down that departments needed a strategic equity strategy, this was one of our first evaluation tools. So what it is, we use these 7 data variables, input variables, to identify the communities that meet these variables. So pretty typical. We align these with what other departments were doing within the city. Our one transportation piece in there is households with no vehicle, but that is also correlates back to income and race and education and all the others. So this has been through a few iterations of change over the years. But I think we're in a steady state now where we are using ACS 5-year estimates. And so really we're on about a 5-year cycle now of refreshing the data. What you see here, and I did not put this on here, but the city calls it the inverted L. So starting from the west side, so left side of the map, you can see the darker green areas represent our underserved communities, and it creates an inverted L across the city. So the other part is the northern part of the city. Those tend to be and historically have been the underserved communities. So this data we actually aggregate to a block group level. Because we need a little more granularity for evaluating transportation projects, where many other departments do aggregate the data to a neighborhood level. Neighborhood works for larger footprints like parks, but for transportation projects, when we're looking at intersection improvements for safety or corridor improvements in certain areas for mobility enhancements, or we're evaluating ADA ramps, the block group level just gives us a little bit more detail, a little bit better way to evaluate our proposed projects. Other things we use this data for is tracking our proposed investment. So when Dottie goes through our budgeting process every year, which seems like it actually never ends, one of the things we propose up to the mayor's office and city council is to show where our projects are going within the city, that they do align with our underserved communities, and that we have kind of a informal target for how much money we invest every year into these underserved communities. I think we shoot, and don't quote me on this, but around 70% of the annual budget does go into these areas. So that is it's not a strict metric. That's just a target we try to shoot for. Sometimes it's more or less. It really depends on the nature of the projects and what they are intended to perform. So getting into our planning process, so Denver Moves Everyone, I mentioned, is our next generation 25-year transportation plan, developed through our transportation planning team. And a big part of it is evaluating equity. So you can see here the 2 kind of branches or pillars of the evaluation process. We use and have developed through the development of this plan a equity toolkit. So the toolkit allows the planners just to ensure they're going through the same steps for every project. I can share some information about this. I'm not getting into the details of how it works, but more or less it gives steps to engage the community, to collect data, to evaluate projects using data, as well as subjective information gathered from the communities, and how that fits into all these different criteria. So mobility, safety, sustainability, community quality. Equity is a piece of all these. And then they move into the everyone piece of the analysis. So this was the biggest change over the last year around how we evaluate equity and how we ensure that we are addressing equity in all of our project prioritization. And we have there's a prioritization process that is all data that happens parallel or prior to these steps. That has as equity, the equity index is part of that. It's a weighted overlay process on steroids, if you will. And then how do we do this in our daily work and our operations and maintenance work? So one example is our transportation operations division. They manage our signs, our signals, fiber network, stripings and markings, everything on the road surface, sidewalks pretty soon. But what this dashboard allows that group to do, and this is just built in an Esri operational dashboard, it basically is comparing our equity index. So you'll see the numbers on here, the 1s, 2s, and 3s are our, and those are kind of the gold areas, are our underserved communities. But we're looking at investments in areas by that 1, 2, and 3 is equity group ranking. That is just what we've called it in our equity index. So investments within those areas, looking at per capita spending by those groups, and then just looking at our work every year compared to the equity index, just to ensure we are on track. We're not avoiding or ignoring any of the communities, and just a way to kind of gut check ourselves to make sure that we are on the right path and that we are meeting our departmental strategic goals around equity. And this is just one example of one tool. We have another one that is a dashboard that compares condition, which is heavily dependent on our data, which we are always working on and in a process now of really enhancing, but comparing our asset condition data to our equity areas, just to ensure that that there's no imbalance there. And with that is all I have. We will come to questions later, I guess, but Diane, I'll let you take it.
Thank you very much, Jason. Yeah, we would, if you want to put your questions in chat, go ahead, and then we will address those after Shaker's presentation. So Shaker Rabban is from the Minnesota DOT, and he's our next presenter. Shaker has worked for MnDOT for 8 years in the areas of program management, long-range planning, and now asset management. And outside of work, Shaker loves outdoor adventures. And so we'll let Shaker take it away now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is my right screen, the correct screen up?
Not yet.
Okay. See? And how about now?
Now we're seeing, oh, now it is. Great.
Great, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. My name is Shaker Rabban. I am the Asset Management Planning Director for the state of Minnesota. Here to talk about kind of what we're doing for equity, how we're incorporating it into our planning processes and long-range plans, and what we intend to do now that we will be updating the TAM as well. So just talking about some equity sort of definitions here. Advancing Transportation Equity Initiative, in addition to ongoing diversity and inclusion work needed to expand our intercultural competence and diversify our workforce, we began the Advancing Transportation Equity Initiative in 2017 after our last statewide multimodal plan update. It's only grown in importance since then, and with the pandemic and of course the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, shining a spotlight on decades of disparities and inequitable systems was a top priority for the state agency. Transportation equity is multifaceted, and MnDOT is working to understand transportation equity from both the contracting to our workforce development to doing engagement on projects. You know, a few examples include doing research with the University of Minnesota on tribal safety, understanding impacts to businesses, especially businesses in sort of those environmental justice underserved communities. We've been having community conversations, sort of where we directly engage with communities based on base groups in rural and urban communities throughout the state. Those conversations have led to us expanding our ongoing efforts to make contracting more equitable and to examine contracting directly with community-based groups and help them build their capacity. And we also have a number of different programs and policies and processes already kind of in place to help sort of shine a light on where some of our equity groups, population groups might be. So equity, kind of let's get into what it means for transportation. So what does transportation equity look like? Equity is hard to understand, as we can often think about what inequity looks like. But when we will know how do we know when we've achieved equity from a transportation standpoint? So let's begin the Advancing Transportation Equity Initiative. The first phase focused on fact-finding and includes community conversations in each of our 8 agency districts. It also aims to better understand how transportation systems, services, and decision-making processes help or hinder the lives of people in underserved and underrepresented communities in Minnesota. Specifically, MnDOT wants to identify key actions that transportation agencies can take to meaningfully change the impact that we have on our underserved communities. So here's just kind of some high-level sort of broad statements here. MnDOT acknowledges the transportation system and agency decisions have underserved, excluded, harmed, and overburdened some communities. We understand some of our past decisions denied Black and Indigenous communities, as well as people with disabilities, the full participation of transportation benefits. And so we are doing what we can to right the wrongs of the past. And by that, we mean, you know, having the benefits and burdens of transportation systems, services, and spending are fair and just and equitably distributed. Which historically has not really been the case. Transportation equity does require ensuring underserved communities, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, share in that power of decision-making, you know, project development, design, and input into the project scoping and final completion process. So the journey of transforming our transportation systems, services, and decision-making process requires ongoing listening, learning, changing, and implementing and adapting to those needs. Everyone in our agency, regardless of position or work assignment, has a role to do that, to advance transportation equity within their role and within their office. We partner with community members, community-based organizations, transportation service and transit service providers, as well as tribal nations and other governments to ensure that our work is being advanced and evolving to serve the needs of the communities. So what do those community conversations look like? We'll kind of get into that here, give you a little bit of a kind of taste of what those entailed. So they were one-on-one conversations. We identified specific communities to engage based on regional demographic analysis that we completed and known considerations based on existing research and based on historical injustices like I-94 going through traditional Black communities in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then we identified organizations working with or representing those communities to help us schedule interviews and conduct our outreach events and efforts. Our approach is one step removed from the community members themselves, so it's more of a kind of grass tops approach rather than grassroots, since we were working with some of these community-based organizations. As these organizations tend to be really good proxies that help us understand exactly what the community need and wants and struggles are from a transportation service perspective. So here, transportation is just one of these main obstacles holding people back in many ways or preventing opportunities and access to jobs, employment, and services. It's not the same as equality as we're hearing. We have to get to know people better and understand what their needs are so we can address them and provide what they actually need on the ground. and help them navigate the convoluted, complex system of transportation services and roadways. So this really all starts in our statewide multimodal transportation plan. Our SMTP is developed by MnDOT. It covers all of our transportation modes and partners. And includes all jurisdictions where MnDOT has any sort of roadway. The SMTP has a 20-year planning horizon, and we update it every 5 years. So we just updated it and adopted it in 2022. And this go around was the first time we were able, the 2022 plan was the first time that equity wasn't an explicit focus point of the SMTP. So here in the SMTP, talk about building capacity to advance equity. We develop transportation equity performance measures within the SMTP, and then implement commitment to transportation equity in subsequent plans, like our 20-year state highway investment plan, our asset management plan, which we're in the process going to begin updating here as well. So it all starts kind of with our overarching SMTP, and then that sort of matriculates its way down through our sort of investment and asset management plans from there. Within the SMTP, we created an equity work group, and that advisory committee reviewed the SMTP plan and our Minnesota State Highway Investment Plan for how to include equity considerations, including engagement approaches and focus on projects, strategy development, different investment scenarios for different assets that have a specific impact to equity outcomes, and draft investment direction that was included within our State Highway Investment Plan. So now that we are near completion of our State Highway Investment Plan, that'll be adopted here pretty soon. And next is updating our Asset Management Plan, which was last completed in 2022. We'll begin updating here this year, next year, to be approved and completed in 2026. So here, the emphasis that we still haven't necessarily scoped this TAMP. These, what we're going to be talking about here are technically all hypothetical, kind of cursory implementation areas we're considering. But a lot of this just may change depending on the response to the RFPs we get, the scope of the TAMP, and how all of it will sort of get identified. GAO report found that even when controlling for factors such as climate type, and even traffic density, that pavement is less likely to be in good condition on roads and census tracts, say with higher percentages of underserved and racial and ethnic populations, communities facing systemic barriers in accessing available benefits, higher family poverty rates in urban areas. So this is a really useful report here at the bottom. There's a link that we included that has some highlights and summaries and recommendations from that Government Accountability Office report. So we're looking at how to incorporate and include different measures that speak to equity sort of outcomes and asset condition as it relates to geographic sort of spatial, where these assets and conditions are, and where our worst sort of payment assets are relative to our these underserved communities. So equity will influence what assets do get included in the TAMP this go around, now that it is a consideration in our overarching processes. As I said, we're currently scoping the TAMP. So just kind of thinking about how to include different elements. We're also updating our project selection scoring policy for our number of different lists of projects and candidates of projects that we choose from. So including things like environmental justice, population groups, where they are relative to potential project locations, and trying to close the gap on pavement condition, by census tracts in urban areas where there are higher percentages of underserved communities. So all this to say is, we kind of began that including and incorporating and having an actual focus on equity in our statewide multimodal transportation plan. Now that we're beginning to update a number of subsequent investment and modal plans beyond that, we're looking at how to include considerations or different outcome measures that would help speak to how we're addressing equity and incorporating equity into our plans, projects, and programs from here on out. So more to come on this, all to say we're kind of thinking about how to include it specifically in asset management, what sort of outcomes we want to be tracking, and how that's going to change and impact just project selection and development from there. So that is all I have.
Thank you very much, Shaker. And thanks to all of our presenters. We really appreciate everybody taking their time to share their expertise. And just a reminder, if you have questions on anything, please type them into the chat feature, or you can unmute and ask it. But we do have 2 questions that were in chat, and so we'll address those first. And then another option would be to raise your hand in the Zoom feature. So the first question that we received was from Anson Gach. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And the question was, would establishing a minimum standard for asset management for area-wide be considered as equitable, and keeping that minimum standard through an area and over a period of time with sufficient budget? I think that William did provide an answer to that in the chat, but William, if you'd like to expand on that, or if either of our other speakers would like to jump in with a response on that one.
I never provide answers. I always provide responses. Yeah, so I provided, just from my understanding, a question by question response on that one. Let me say, look at this again. How do we implement equity analysis into maintaining current infrastructure? Well, it's not easy. I think that challenges that I've heard across the nation is still beginning with, what the heck does equity have to do with asset management? The next is understanding that it is just another piece of information that you use to consider. It can help you prioritize or help provide you insight into asset management investments you could make. I tried to point you to data sets that are available so you can consider looking at those in line with the data that you have in your organization. I'd say first is you got to start. You got to start testing it and looking at it and really seeing, could this potentially lead me towards different discussions or decisions. The next one is, what's the right level of compromise? That's an interesting question. I think that the more contemporary training and research that we have on equity is you're not searching for a compromise. And seriously, with asset management, I don't see why you couldn't have both. Many agencies are existing in a place where there's more need than dollars available. It's just a thing that we lack is truly insight on what is the role of good assets in line with addressing community needs. We maintain assets because we put it into a model. It spits out, here's the money, here's the time, here's the benefit that it can achieve, but it's missing that benefit that could be achieved with people and communities, that equity lens within it. But you got to remember, primarily, it's driven off a condition. You're gonna have something that has a condition need, and it's really about understanding that as it correlates to the community's needs. And then the last question, that isn't a flippant yes. That is yeah, there is. Last time I actually gave the presentation on the case study, someone came back to me and said, hey, William, we got this area where there's a bridge, or not a bridge, a wall. And the wall was used to retain earth from a building that used to exist, but the wall itself cut off a community and the building's no longer there. And yet, the DOT wants to put money towards maintaining this wall. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I wouldn't necessarily call that asset management, but there are absolutely situations where because something was built and it no longer serves its intended purpose, you need to rethink just doing asset management on it. I think Detroit, Michigan is a great example where the migratory pattern out of Detroit has left them with entire streets with nobody in a house, nobody occupying it, and no need to actually maintain those roads. And years ago, they started going to and letting those roads just be reduced to gravel, turning the neighborhoods into open spaces and parks and rethinking it. So, my general response is, yeah, absolutely. It does become counterproductive to the mission of equity, but it's driven more so by is that asset still needed to serve an intended purpose, and more so understanding what the intended purpose is. It's people that use it. Oh, hey, I see that post from Cleef. I think I actually looked at some of your research in framing this. If you're the one from CSU, so thank you for posting that.
So thanks, William, for providing those examples. And we do have one other question that came in the chat, and it was a little long. So Aiden, if you'd like to, unmute and ask the question yourself, you can.
Actually,
or
that
other...
was the one I was responding to, Diane.
I thought you were responding to the first one.
Let me go back to the first one. Out of sight, out of
mind. The first one was about the minimum standard.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. I was working my way back up to the beginning, and I did provide a quick response to Anson. There is, minimum standard on the asset does not necessarily match to a standard that is desired by the people who use it, by the community. And that somewhere in there, there's probably a number of sweet spots that you would try to uncover, to gain insights on. And all the equity lens is doing is asking for you to consider that. Consider it from a lens of disproportionately impacted communities. Consider it from a lens of people who don't necessarily have cars. Consider it from a lens of people who may have to drive tractors down it, or may have to walk down it. And it really is just including the consideration beyond just trying to achieve a state of good repair through asset treatments in and of themselves. So I like to keep you on your toes, Diane, by doing things the wrong way.
That's okay. Jason or Shaker, do you have anything you'd like to add in response to either of those questions? And you don't have to go in order because, William didn't.
I guess around the minimum standards, my comment or my thought, this is one thing we are working on, Dottie's working on this year, is we have KPIs that we track for all of our assets. Those are based around target conditions for the entire system. So those are ingrained in some of our work planning and maintenance planning to make sure we are hitting those targets. But what we'll be working on this year is, what do our level of service targets look like? Those should be based on what the community expectations are. Those expectations could vary across the communities. So some of our more affluent communities may have different expectations than our traditionally underserved communities. So I think you could have, and we'll see how this works for us, but different level of service, different quality targets within different communities. So that would be a good way to track, potentially, to make sure you are meeting the needs of the communities, and not just for us, a city as a whole, because again, some neighborhoods may have different expectations than others. So going back to what everybody has said is understanding what those communities desire, what their expectations are, will help you in evaluating your equity approach and to make sure you are meeting those goals.
Yeah, the Shaker. I'll just add one thing. We've kind of played around with and have sort of looked at and been wanting to explore in different research ways, but it's, you know, quantifying the benefit and impact from certain transportation projects to these communities too. It's not necessarily something that DOTs are exactly skilled or set up for measuring and quantifying per se, as and there's no real standard guidelines or measures to include, but trying to determine, you know, what's the benefit from adding, you know, say an intersection or different multimodal non-motorized facilities versus what's the impact from a pollution standpoint, noise and traffic routing standpoint, those sorts of things is kind of a quantifying and trying to measure what the benefits and impacts are to these communities from a transportation project.
Thanks, Shaker. Anna, do you have anything you'd like to add from the AASHTO perspective?
No, I did just want to mention there was one more question in here for Shaker. That came, and it was how do you best identify and dialogue with those community organizations for your grass tops approach? I didn't know if you had anything to add on that one.
Sorry, yeah, was it how do we identify them?
Identify and dialogue with those community organizations, yeah.
Yeah, we identified them. I think we sort of had a whole list of what are the nonprofit community-based organizations within the Twin Cities area. What are the kind of groups they're working with, immigrant communities, you know, sensitive environmental groups or low-income groups, and then reached out to them to help them bring those groups into different engagement events, you know, along the entire SMTP development process. Just because those groups know better kind of what works for their communities, their constituents, oftentimes providing translation services for those events too, which was really helpful. Helping disseminate some materials prior to those engagement outreach events was definitely helpful too.
Great, thanks, Shaker. And I think this is great. What I'd love to see is the questions and discussion at the end generating more. So we have a few more. And again, I think this is for Jason, William, Shaker. However, I think one of the great questions here from Maria, how do you measure that you've met equity? Really? Like how do we say yes, we've done it? Who has some thoughts to share on that one? That one.
Well, I'm not shy, so I will chime in.
Thanks, Jason.
I don't think you'll in our lifetimes get to a point where we can say we've met equity. It would be fantastic, but I'm not sure we'll ever actually get there. But we are always striving to do that. So I think all we can do is set those goals, those targets for ourselves, and ensure that we are meeting or exceeding our targets and goals. So I come back to the level of service targets. What does the community expect from us? What services do they expect from us, and the quality of those services? So are we meeting those expectations? And so it comes back to understanding those expectations from those communities. And then I mentioned earlier, doing that post-project analysis, going out and checking that the projects we are implementing and the services we're providing and the new you know, bike facilities and mobility access and transit access and those things we are providing, are those really helping those communities? Are they helping those communities advance? Understanding that to make sure we are doing the right work and doing them in the right areas. And it's not an easy thing to do. And I mentioned that we are still kind of working through how we do that analysis, and we aren't there yet. And it's a lot of information to capture, and especially community input on things. How do we track that? How do we put it into a database so that we can mine that? So these are all kind of hurdles you have to work through to understand if you are meeting your equity goals.
I think that's really helpful. I will put a plug in here. On our Committee for Performance-Based Management, we do have a task force that works on emerging performance measures, and equity is one of the focus areas that that this group is really looking into right now. if anyone is interested in joining that group to kind of continue that discussion and weigh in on that, we would please let me know. I'm happy to send you the information on that meeting. And here's, we're gonna wrap it up with the last question. I know we're kind of watching the time to get everybody out of here. But Amy had a question, and Amy, I don't know if you want to come in and talk about this as unmute and talk about it, but has anyone incorporated a PEL study? And I've what is it, planning and environmental linkages? Is that what it is? Study with their asset management planning to help address equity. I don't know if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on that, or Amy, if you wanted to unmute and just kind of mention what you were thinking with that one.
Well, it sounds like maybe that's one to
Maybe
think
not.
about in the future.
Yep.
So I guess if we're ready to wrap up, the next webinar will be held June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, as usual. TAM webinar 69 will focus on TAM organizations and people, and there will be more information to come out on that as we line up the speakers. And then also there's going to be TAM case studies mini series, and the first session is on May 29th, which is Don't Let Financial Uncertainty Derail Your TAMP, Strategies for Identifying and Managing Financial Risks. And then there will be another one in June, and that one is Risk Busters, Unleashing the Power of Effective Organizational Risk Management. So stay tuned for more information on those. They are both already posted on the TAM portal, so you can go out there and register for those. So you will be hearing from us soon about other webinars on the schedule. You can sign up to get the updates on those in your inbox, and we hope everyone will be able to join us. Again, the TAM webinars are scheduled every 2 months, and please, feel free to send in any other ideas you have for webinars or things like that. And the final reminder is that the portal is at tam-portal.com. And that's all I have, but Amy did add that she didn't think her mic was working in the chat. So sorry, we're not going to be able to get Amy to join us on that, but does anybody have any other final comments?
I'd say for comments like that, the research symposium would be an interesting place to pose questions like that, because it may be a pain point that we need to address through some more advanced research.
Okay. Well, I think then we're ready to wrap up for today. And again, I really appreciate all of our speakers and everyone that took the time to attend the presentations. And thank you very much for your engagement on this topic. It's an important one.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you all.